Hello and welcome to the third episode of Chicago Dialogues, Series 2. I am Dipesh Chakrabarty. I teach in the History Department and in South Asian Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. I'm also currently the Faculty Director of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. This series called Chicago Dialogues is produced by the University of Chicago Center in Delhi in collaboration with Prohar.in, who provides us with a platform, and they're based in India. And we have the well-known author and poet and entrepreneur, Mr. Abhik Chanda, as the curator of this series. He's backstage today, along with our Prohar colleagues. And I'm very grateful, as always, to both Prohar, Abhik, and my colleagues at the center for the successful running of this series. So today we are going to talk about a very important topic, climate change, the problems of messaging it, with three very distinguished colleagues who are joining us from different parts of the world. So we have Minal Pathak, who is a senior scientist at Ahmedabad University in Ahmedabad in India, and she's joining us from there. And Minal has worked for a long time now with IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and contributing to their third report, the report on mitigation. And then we have Professor Emilienne Baneth-Nouailhetas joining us from Paris. And Emilienne is actually a scholar of postcolonial literature, but now she's also the vice president for international relations for PSL, this conglomerate university that was set up around 2010, I think, and that has many distinguished French institutions under its umbrella. And she is very interested in this question of climate change, both as an academic and as a university administrator. And we also have Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, whom I can describe, just as I could describe Minal, as well as two friends of the center. And they've been involved in the activities of the center. And Sabyasachi actually participated in a very interesting conversation on physics last year with my colleague Sid Nagel. And so Sabyasachi Bhattacharya is a renowned physicist who worked for a long time in the US and then was headhunted back to India to head up the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And then since that job, he's also taught at Presidency University in Calcutta and Ashoka University in Delhi, and now heads up a new research institution called the TCG CREST, Center for Research in Science and Center for Research and Education in Science and Technology, something of that kind. But Sabyasachi is actually in Chicago and is joining us from Chicago, and I'm in Chicago myself. So with that introduction, I want to call on my friends to say a little bit about share with their thoughts on this problem. But before that, let me just introduce the topic in a general way. Climate change is a fascinating problem in the sense that it is often written up as the most serious threat that human civilization has ever faced. Or it's written up as people talk about climate emergency, the IPCC talks about climate emergency. But at the same time, we have the strange fact of countries, people, individuals being slow to react to it. Now, it's not like we have not moved at all. Compared to the time when the IPCC was set up, late 1980s, we have definitely made progress. I mean, now the news about climate change is everywhere, the words are everywhere, and even the kind of denialism that we used to see early in this century, even 10, 15 years ago, we don't quite see it. But at the same time, as late as 2000, 2015, a Republican senator, as you may remember, walked into the Senate and rolled a snowball on the floor of the Senate, saying, "You say global warming? Look at this snowball. It's just outside. It's snowing so much." So it's sort of, so it's a problem where which produced multiple stories. So how do we look on it? Do we look on it as a threat to civilization? Do we look on it as a story of a possible sixth great extinction? Do we look on it as a story of sea levels rising this century and and uh, and producing more climate refugees and putting cities underwater? Do we look on it as a problem of transition to renewable fuel and renewable energy? Um, do we look on it as a problem of the expansion of the human domain? Sort of, is cutting down forests. Clearly, deforestation is part of climate change. Some people even connect the pandemic to the same set of problems that are causing climate change. So one is talking about a problem that lends itself to many different kinds of narratives, it seems to me, many different kinds of stories that work out on different time scales. So, and then people in their everyday life, I suppose, find the evidence to be messy, right? Sort of, you might suddenly get a very harsh winter, or you suddenly have a downpour. Um, even the question is, when we talk about communicating climate change, the question is, what is it about climate change that we're trying to communicate? And since we're all academics talking here, I think it would be nice to eventually talk about what we can do as academics in the classroom, in our institutions, through our institutions. You know, I, teachers are kind of activists when they're teaching, or by which I do not mean that teachers have to be ideologically disposed, but it's one place where we message our knowledges, we communicate with younger generations. So maybe with that, I'll ask Minal to share her thoughts, because she works for IPCC. She is a senior scientist working on this problem. So we'll start with Minal. And I would like this to be very much a conversation. So please feel free to cut in if you have something to say. But the order I have in mind, just to start ourselves off, is to first begin with Minal and then go to Emilienne and then to Shobha. Okay. So Minal, please.
Thank you so much, Dipesh, and thank you for this very interesting introduction. And I'm really honored to be here. So, well, speaking from a scientist's point of view and someone who's been struggling to communicate science to different audiences, maybe more strongly for the last 3 or 4 years, since the IPCC's 1.5 report. And so maybe I can raise a few issues that I face. And maybe I'd love to hear from you and the panel of what we can do to advance this. And I think I agree with you, Dipesh, that the biggest challenge is to work on our messages in this dynamic context, right? Because climate change and the science is evolving so rapidly, and and so is the politics around climate change. And the struggle is really, how do we modify our messages, um, tailored to different audiences? And where I struggle really is the glass half full versus the glass half empty. And maybe it's just a question I don't have an answer to, but how do I communicate to the audiences the sense of efficacy that they are actually part of the solution, but yet given the urgency there is also a sense of threat, and that balancing while messaging is really, I think, the biggest challenge we face today. I mean, the good news is a lot of these conversations are happening, right? So many of these. And since maybe COVID and all this digitalization, it has facilitated these a lot more than what we would have thought 5 years ago. And yet, since I started working on the 1.5 report, and now the time and space for action has shrunk so much. So we really have to. I think the other challenge really is to how to like have a lot more of these conversations, but also deeper conversations. Like you
How
engage
do you
with the
mean?
audience really. Yeah,
What do you mean by
yeah.
deeper conversations?
I mean, like when I go into an event and try to speak about climate change, and then maybe I say, "What's climate change? Why is it happening? What are the solutions?" I want to hear back from the audience on how they feel that it touches them, or how they feel they're part of the solution. And I don't think we are having these two-way conversations, not as much as we would like to. But and I mean, I'd just like to close with one third issue that I would like to bring on this talk is, as teacher now, how do we get younger people to love the planet, for want of a better word? I think Dipesh, you raised a question around reverence in a previous talk,
Right.
and maybe if people worship or fear, but maybe I think the thing is about love. How do they love the species and the birds and the trees and, yeah, whatever the earth has to offer, and that it's all going away very rapidly, and what, like, they really need to do something about it. But I'll stop
It's
here maybe
interesting,
on that.
Minal, that you say that because the Harvard biologist Edward Wilson, he coined this word biophilia. So he was actually arguing that humans have biophilia, that we are almost programmed to love nature, that we are programmed to like the world as we find it, the seas, the clouds, the skies, which is why we write poetry, we sing songs, we celebrate it. So in some ways, it's interesting to hear you say that we have to teach humans to do it. But Wilson would argue that we already have it in us. That's where we're most comfortable. In other words, if you build cities without any trees, without any birds, I think humans would not really love it. They would actually want to have cities with trees, with birds, with lakes, with parks, with water. I mean, I live in Chicago, and the Michigan Lake is just magical. I mean, and we often imagine Chicago, living in Chicago without the lake, and it feels so oppressive, right? So it's interesting that somewhere you're suggesting that humans have lost that love.
I think we need to relearn, maybe.
Okay, yeah, maybe I can bring in Emilienne at this point. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First, I would like to say thank you. It's wonderful for me to be participating in this conversation, and a great opportunity to discuss questions which are very close to my heart. As you pointed out, Dipesh, I am a humanist. I started in literature with a passion for literature. So I think I hear what you are saying, Minal, when you speak of awakening that sort of passion. I experienced something I hope every young person can experience, to have that flow of understanding of what you want to do in life. And I think the priority now, and that is the question, we don't want this priority to become a handicap or paralyzing or petrifying, but the priority is safeguarding some of the conditions which we love in our civilization, in the way the world works, in the blue planet itself, and without, at the same time, being paralyzed with fear that we can do nothing. I would like to enter this conversation with my background, of course, as a humanist, but also as a university administrator and as a former diplomat. I worked for a while in academic cooperation, and this gave me the opportunity to see some of the points where there might be a lack in climate change messaging. So I'm not going to go over all the very important grounding concepts which you go through in your book. I would not do it as well at all. I'd just like to identify a few points of blockage which I would like to focus on when it comes to efficient messaging, and how all these points of blockage should be simultaneously addressed and very carefully addressed, because addressing one only can cause harm in unblocking the others. It's a bit like the energy points in a body, I would say. You cannot get all the energy to flow through one point only. and the way of dealing with them according to the country might differ. So the first point, it seems very basic, but I think it needs to be addressed, is distrust of science, or inadequate understanding of the science. To just illustrate this, I'll speak from my point of view as university administrator. We are in a university where the youth, the students are very well educated. We are highly selective, and at the same time, of course, we pride ourselves in encouraging diversity and diversity of views. But even so, in this highly selective, multidisciplinary university, in conversations with students who are activists for climate change action, I've realized that they think their peers who are not activists are not well educated enough. And they have put to me that it is important for climate change action not to be grounded in a form of faith. It should not be, I believe in climate change, or I don't, because that then puts us in resonance with, as you said, people who are still in denial, or who are even militant for denial, which is worse, of course, because they have an agenda behind it. And they say, we need our colleagues, whether they're studying business, management, or the humanities, or ancient languages, to understand the basics. Because in a conversation, they could have great leverage, except if they say, well, I just know it's happening. And then as soon as somebody asks, but why exactly? They say, well, I just know. A good student or a basic student, even after graduation, should know, in general terms, how current goes through an electric wire. And similarly, they should know the basics about climate change. So this needs to be addressed. As a diplomat, I was very encouraged to see how in Indonesia, a program for education of science teachers was full-heartedly adopted. And they were, when I left in 2019, thinking of opening a climate change education office in Jakarta. But at the same time, I saw that these science teachers really needed really basic workshops. How does it work? What is the greenhouse effect? Which gases are trapped? How can they be? How can we reduce emissions? Which economic field produces the most? Things like that. Mm. The second question, which I think needs to be addressed, is overconfidence in technology. Because this, in a way, annihilates efforts of making awareness, of drawing awareness towards action. Unfortunately, this exists, and it doesn't mean that we should say technology will not work or will not save us. But we cannot say, as I've heard, oh, this is the same case. Remember, in 1870, people thought that Paris would be buried under horse dung, but in the end, we had the automobile, and so all turned out well. This is an analogy I've heard several times. Oh, so, we just forge ahead, and somehow things will pan out. That's a second problem, I think. Science is not the same as technology. So the science gives us explanations, but we should not either tell the scientists, you have come with a problem, so please bring us to the solution as well, or else, in a way, we will ignore it. The third problem is cynicism, which can play at individual level or at a more global social level. So individual cynicism is at the level of the absence of intergenerational justice. We just think, oh, after me, the flood. In French, we have an expression for this. Après moi, le déluge. Après nous, after us, the flood. Meaning us individually.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm not going to elaborate on that, but that's, of course, a very understandable, selfish and cynical reaction. But we can tell people, whatever their age, they can do something. And it's increasingly important, in fact, for elders to be models for the younger people, or else we risk intergenerational strife on top of all the other catastrophes that are awaiting us. The other type of cynicism is a form of a death wish for humanity. But I have encountered it. And it is, well, we have not done the planet any good. So after all, it will repair itself after. And so, why should I do anything individually? Because I don't really care what happens. This is a very, I find it extremely cynical and disingenuous, but it does exist. Maybe I should. So then I have, in fact, for these 3 points, just solutions. I think climate change education helps us address the first blockage.
Maybe,
really.
Emilienne, hold on to the solutions. We'll come to the solutions.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You've already raised some fascinating points, both about the whole question of distrust of science and the distinction between science and technology. And I just, before I bring Shobo in, because I know that Shobo will have a lot to say about this. I also find that the distrust of science and ignorance of science works and ignorance of differences between different kinds of sciences, right? That physics is not the same as geology. And that I find sometimes astonishingly, even if I may say so with all respect, even among my humanist colleagues.
Absolutely.
There is a kind of there's a strand within what we call science studies, which is different from scientific studies, where humanists study scientists, which is sort of often so focused on the questions of power that it, and whether science is only Europeans' contribution, whether Europe owes a lot to other places, these kind of questions of democracy in history writing and all that sometimes one gets the message that science is all about just some powerful people getting away with their facts because they're powerful, and railroading smaller people who have different facts because the smaller people are not powerful. So sometimes you do get this strand, even within academic writing, that there are many different kinds of sciences, and they're all at the same level of validity. And that's an interesting. Okay, so I just want to register the problem. The question about science, that science is not technology, also strikes me as a very important point, because I find that even people who are very skeptical about science are very quick to use technology. So technology works through different principles of addiction, I often feel, particularly personalizable technology like your cell phone, your laptop. So that I thought was also very interesting. And you also raised many other interesting points. But I know that Shobo has thoughts about the science, humanities question. And plus, he'll have also his thoughts about the problem. So let me bring Shobo in at this point, and then we'll come back to some of the common points and points of mutual interest. Shobo.
Thank you, Dipesh. It's a great pleasure to be back in Chicago Dialogues once again and to have such wonderful panelists. And the advantage of going last is that what you wanted to say have already been said. And I really wish to thank both Minal and Emilienne for getting to the heart of the difficulties that we face in communicating climate change. So what I'd like to say is that climate change is difficult because it's a complex problem. Messaging climate change is even more difficult. And the most difficult thing is to message in such a way that it's effective, in the sense that it creates at least some action items by which, barring the cynical ones who want us to all perish, bring it back, bring us back from the brink of the disaster. So what I would like to add to that is perhaps this is not very well understood or appreciated, that even within the domain of scientists, the enthusiasm for climate change or the trust in climate change is significantly less than one would expect. And this is my personal view, and I'll have a few points to make, which are essentially historical, philosophical, and sociological, and not scientific. The first point is the early days. When the temperature fluctuates, we didn't know whether these are fluctuations, which will just are there, or there is a trend. And we like causal relationships and not correlational relationships. Till we understand, have established a causal connection, we have trouble trusting correlational observations. And this was in the past. And I just like to remind you, the American Physical Society, of which I'm a member, is the world's largest group of physicists, more than 50,000 members. As early as in 2007, the council adopted climate change to be a scientifically valid proposition. And so we are talking about 14 years ago. And then you'd expect that all members will stand up and say, we agree with you, but that has not happened. So why is that? And I'd like to say that it's somewhat historical. And that is, over the last 2 to 3 centuries, we believed in kind of two contradictory thoughts. One thought is that we are so small that no matter what we do is not going to affect the big, which is our planet or the cosmos or the large one. And at the same time, the opposite side is that we are small, but we are so brilliant that we can become victors over nature. And that nature involves the planet in which which we inhabit, and all the problems and the limitations and the constraints that nature has placed upon us, including boundaries of planets and climate, everything else, will be victors over this. Okay, so these, if you see, are contradictory. We are too small to make a difference, yet you will be victorious over it. So now I'll go a little technical, and I'll say the most profound scientific concept that pervades all of science and all of nature and everything so far we know is known as the subject of thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is the physics or science of engines. And it was developed by scientists during the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution. And for 300 years, they had given us fantastic progress in some definition of progress. So these are engines. And what goes into this engine is basically this notion that the engine takes energy from a source, does some work, which is the useful stuff, and then it dumps the energy into a sink. But both the source and the sink are so enormous that what little we do in between has no impact on from where we take the energy and where we dump the energy. And this is the mantra, if you like, has been very, very effective for 300 years. And let me get back to Emilienne's very, very succinct position, is that the fruits of Industrial Revolution we consume with great happiness without trusting it. Okay, so the fruits of technology are here to be used and consumed. We all carry the cell phone in our pocket, can't live a day, a minute without it. Yet we do not quite trust technology. And this is also kind of true not only in the general public, but also in the scientific community, where perhaps the appreciation for technology is somewhat greater. So therefore, what I'd like to point out is that we have run into a problem which requires us to kind of give up the notion that science alone and technology alone will be able to solve a problem. In fact, we have met our match. So we have built it up to the level where something has happened, whether this is, this is not a fatalistic position that we had to face this, but we now have faced the problem that we are no longer so small. We are still the same size as we were, but our technologies have acquired dimensions which are comparable to the planet. We can wipe out forests. We can change the course of rivers. We can create drought. We can do amazing stuff that only 300 years we would consider we are too small to address. So what I'd like to say, I just want to make this point only, is that the way, we can talk about remediation issues, how to address what the solutions are. But I suggest to you that the problem we are facing is a result of our own doing. That not only as academics, not only have we not taken cognizance that there is a holistic way of looking at education that was necessary, and partly because of the success, if you like, of technology and science over 300 years, and that if we still stay in the academic community with the same notion that science will eventually solve the problem. This Paris, there is a Los Angeles version of the Paris story, that there was so much smog. What do? So you invent catalytic converters and the smog disappears. So the great faith in science and technology also says, oh, we just go merrily along and science will come up with some extraordinary achievement which will solve the problem. So all I'm trying to say is that even within the community of scientists, how they interact with the rest of us and how the rest of us views us has been problematic for a very long period of time. And now there is no escape, that unless we have a combined effort, the problem is unlikely to be addressable anytime soon. I'll end there.
Thank you, Shobho. I mean, many issues have come up, and we can address all of them or some of them. One of the things, of course, the very question of the authority that scientists wield, the respect that they command, is it also varies in history, in my knowledge, from one country to another, from one period to another. When I lived in Australia, which was for about 20 years, I used to see that the Aboriginal people were extremely dependent on archaeologists to tell them for how long they'd lived in that country. And in my time in Australia, the years increased from 30,000 years to 50,000 years. And that contributed directly to the land rights claims of Aboriginal people. So archaeologists wielded a particular kind of authority in public life, which in the Indian case, in India was sorely missing when it came to the question of Ram Janam Bhoomi and ascertaining whether or not there was a Hindu temple underlying that mosque that was brought down by people, right? So it seems to me that that what kind of authority expertise would have, varies. Though I think overall, in my mind, it's also tied to another question. The more people feel disenfranchised, the less they come to trust authority, it seems to me, or people in authority, institutions. And then there's a tendency to lump scientists with institutions. And within the academy, it also seems to me that some of the humanist resentment of the sciences or the mistrust of the sciences also comes from a perception that scientists and policymakers wield enormous and disproportionate amount of powers within institutions. I'm just raising these questions. We can go in those directions. But then let me come back to the question of messaging, which is what all of you have touched. And my question really is, when you think of climate change, what are we clear about what the message is? Is it because I hear different messages. Sometimes I hear, even the question of what is sustainable varies. Some people would say we can have sustainable models or present levels of consumption if we switch to renewables. So it's really a question of energy transition. And some people at the other end would say the civilization is not sustainable. This kind of civilization is not sustainable. The consumerist civilization is not sustainable. So what is the object that we want to sustain itself seems to vary. And the other question I have for all three of you, if you think democratically, then isn't being cynical, being indifferent, being in denial, aren't these also things that humans do? And shouldn't there be room for allowing humans to do that? Or, it goes back to this question that was sometimes discussed kind of 10, 12 years ago, whether there should be a climate dictatorship or whether you can actually deal with the problem allowing for the democratic spirit to live on. In other words, allow conversations, but in which you have to acknowledge that there will be people who will disagree with you fundamentally and who may take positions that are denialist, that are cynical. So that's a question I throw open to all three of you. Emilienne also had very interesting things to say about it. Minal also has encountered it and probably has interesting things to say about it. And of course, you Shobha too. So anyway, you can take it whichever way you want. I just wanted to raise those points. Who would like to go first? Emilienne?
Yes, thank you. The question of a climate dictatorship, put that way, it's a very stark question. I think it's interesting because the United States is going through a difficult time in terms of dealing with threats to democracy, and they see it more from the other side, the possibility of climate denialists taking over, because it's a better future to sell, I suppose, to say that all this is not true and it's still snowing. See, but I think the possibility that it could go totally on the other side, towards somebody who will say, "Listen, enough fooling around. Now we're not voting anymore because you cannot be trusted." It's also really out there. I think that's quite a possibility, but it would not. To me, this would not take on unless we are in the middle of a catastrophe, in which case I have no solution to bring. But
Emilienne, if I could just interrupt you for a minute. That statement that you just made, unless we are in the middle of a catastrophe, that the meaning of that statement, I would submit to you, is so unevenly distributed. Some people are in the middle of a catastrophe. So if you go around the coastline in India, where sea levels are rising, and you talk to poor people, you'll find they're already facing climate change. The fish they catch is different. To find fresh water to cook with is more trouble. So it's already the question of inequality it can already shapes our choice of the tense or our choice of creating a conditional phrase when you say unless, until, and for some people the until is no longer there, it's already there. So just want to interrupt you to make that point, but sorry about interrupting.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. I was talking about the USA, and to a certain degree, the USA are also in the middle of a catastrophe in certain areas. I mean, there is an extreme drought in Arizona. The water levels are extremely low. I think 30% of the reservoirs. The Navajo Nation is suffering terribly. So there. You are right. It's not only outside of the United States, but and you've put me on the spot. I have no answer to that. These are, to me, if I look at political history, the ideal conditions for dictatorship to take on, and naturally, that is not something that can be desirable. But you said democratically, isn't cynicism something humans do? I agree with that. It is something humans do, but I do think we can pose the conditions to lessen the cynicism. Cynicism grows when there's the sense that there is no way out. And I think that's what we're trying to address here. I let the other panelists talk
Sure.
while I mull over
Yeah.
an optimistic follow-up.
Minal?
Yeah, well, considering that I'm the odd apple in this panel, somebody who comes from the science side, and really my understanding on
Well, you and
politics is.
Shobhu are both from the science side. Shobhu doesn't do
All
climate
right.
science like you do, but
But yeah, but he's converted partly a lot more into the humanities side of it. So he's both, I think. But anyway, coming back to your question, so I mean, if you convince humanity that climate change is a global problem and that we're all collectively working towards a solution, that's not really climate dictatorship. So I think the problem is that we are dismantling big power structures, whether you talk about the fossil fuel lobby or the automobile lobby, and so I think we have to fight. And so I'm on the side of science, and I'm willing to say it a bit boldly that we will need solutions that go far beyond how society is operating right now, and we need to say it strongly. So I don't think there is anything wrong, and if there is a denial, then we have to work around it. I mean, we should. I'm sure there is room for denial, but I don't think scientifically we have enough evidence to show that this is happening.
but
So
Minal,
I.
if I may ask
Yeah.
you, so both working with IPCC and in your own
Hmm.
thinking,
Hmm.
since climate change does not pose one danger, it
Right.
poses multiple dangers.
Right.
Which ones would you pick as the most urgent ones to communicate?
I mean, in terms of the impacts, you mean? I
No,
would.
if you're trying to communicate to people the urgency of the problem, and since
Right.
climate change is not one problem, it's many problems or many
Right.
aspects to the problem, which
Right.
aspect would you highlight for immediate addressing?
I mean, always start my presentations with the gap, that there is a very, very big gap and the gap is increasing, and the window is closing. And I show a graph which shows how far we've
So
emitted and
gap
where we
gap
are
between
going.
what? Gap between what?
Gap between emissions now and where we'll go, and what does it mean for global temperature. And and sometimes it's challenging because people don't really think 2 degrees is a lot. And I was talking incidentally to a class in University of Chicago. I was invited to a literature class,
Okay.
and one of the students brought, I cannot remember the name of the poet, but I think there was a poem which talked about a baby's temperature, and if a baby's temperature increases by 2 degrees, and that's impactful. So I think we really need new ways of communicating, I think. But I'm deviating from the question here. And I think, yeah, well, I'll just wait for others to come in, and then maybe we can revisit this.
Okay, sure. Shobho?
So the problem, it seems to me, the problem is so vast that if we wish to have a perfect answer, that would not be very useful. So, perfection is the enemy of progress. So we have to make progress, even though this does not solve all problems. And one of the way, we tend to justify inaction is pointing out which problems the step you are proposing will not solve. As if by considering what you are not going to solve, your option is really inaction. And that is a fallacy that is very common in conversations, in discussions, everywhere else, that we want a perfect solution or nothing at all. So as academics, I feel that this, I still consider myself a scientist, my sympathy for humanity is notwithstanding.
You are one.
And now, what can we do? And so this not being able to do anything takes back to the first problem which gave us this, that we are too small to make a difference. Therefore, we could destroy the planet because we couldn't think that was possible. Similarly, we are again too small to make a difference in, getting us out of it, which is also not true. But we could do certain things. As an academic, I think that our education system is severely lacking. And of course, it's not uniform across the globe. There are big differences, and these differences are historical, cultural, sociological, various different things. But basic education system has a flaw. So, and the flaw is that what is the minimum that you wish to teach? And today, to say that, in our childhood, we used to say that you have to learn the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay, so a couple of letters are dropped, but 3 R's. And what I like to say, and my mathematician colleagues will like this perhaps, is that I say 3 R's plus what I call CC's. Now, CC is a name for complex conjugate. Okay, so most numbers are complex, meaning they have a real part and an imaginary part, and they have a complex conjugate. And so, the 3 R's, if you like, are the actual numbers, but we need to have their complex conjugate. And the fact that we are dealing with a problem which is complex, and this year's the past Nobel Prize explicitly acknowledges this for the first time, if I in my memory, that they have done so explicitly, that complex systems cannot be taught the way we have taught linear, independent, simple systems. And this is hard, both as science and as a way to communicate to people who are not hardcore scientists. Even for hardcore scientists, it is not easy. So nonlinear systems, complex systems are difficult. So some effort needs to be made, I would suggest. I'd like to come up with some kind of a slogan, that can catch on. So I would say message the messenger. Okay. So you cannot perhaps in a difficult situation like this go straight to the final consumer, but you can get to the teachers. You can get to the opinion makers of society, and perhaps they are on your side, and they would also like to avoid this disaster as much as all living human beings ought to. But they need to be given the equipment to deal with an innocent sounding question from a young student. And instead of hemming and hawing, they should give an answer that's persuasive, and to communicate the essence of what a complex system is, what the multi-dimensional aspects of them are, what is essentially different from a linear, superposition of linear problems versus a single nonlinear problem. Not that it's not known, but it is still restricted to the very elite group of academics who study this, write great papers and all of that. But simple examples are there. For example, even before the global climate problem became kind of undeniable in some sense, local climate problem has been available for 100 years, nearly 50 for sure, but maybe even 100
more than that.
Probably more than that.
From the logbook of ships, yeah.
And so therefore, if we were clever, we would have taken lessons from it. But I think that there ought to be a very serious attempt made in the academic circle to make this complex system science, if you like, and its interdependence on the culture
of the history, of the philosophy, of the sociology, which almost always goes unstated, but nevertheless is a major presence in your efforts to
Shobho, if I may interrupt you here, and I want to bring Emilienne in, but before I bring her in, I think one lesson from, or one suggestion that you're making, which I agree with it from my own experience, is that I think that the division of two cultures between science and humanities is not helping us very much
right.
in the universities.
That's correct.
And I think just because I also noticed that the scientists, I find it very difficult sometimes to actually explain to colleagues in science what the contributions humanists are making to the problem, because they sometimes are so focused on problem solving projects that they can't see the bigger narrative that humanists might be creating, or questions of value, as Minal was saying, how loving the earth or fearing it or having reverence for it, whatever. So I think the two cultures is becoming a problem even within universities in communications. And one of the good things we are doing at Chicago, and I think many other universities are now doing it, is we're actively thinking about how to make climate change and energy issues university-wide issues to be considered by all faculty, all departments, and maybe to create fora where people can come together to hear each other and see how people think about those problems. So that, I mean, you are giving the instance of complexity theory as something that everybody should understand. And I'm saying that institutionally that needs the creation of platforms where people can come together and hear each other, whereas research-wise, we're all siloed into different disciplines and departments. But let me bring Emilienne in now on this one or anything else that she has to say.
Thank you very much. I'm very concerned by this question of the disciplinary split. And I think it's you, Dipesh, earlier you said that even among humanists there may be, yes, it's you stated that there may be a sort of a feeling of disconnect with science as a tool for power, and therefore a rejection. And I have seen that a lot. This will, to heal this quickly, it will need effort from both sides, of course. Not only from the humanists to understand what science actually is and differentiate different kinds of sciences, differentiate science from a technological problem-solving kit. Right. But it will also ask for some effort from, I think, scientists who, for some, do have this connection. Naturally, they are consulted by committees, and, administrators, and so on, and they seldom. I mean, I'm very sorry to generalize this way, but this is my experience in my interactions. I have seldom, not never, but seldom heard these science and engineering experts state that we need to reframe our thinking about what man is and what humanity can do. And I think the way you are putting it, Sabya, is very telling. It's very eloquent. I think we may have a pathway here to say humanity thought we were too small to have much of an impact on the cosmos, certainly even on the planet, but we did. And so we can, again, have an impact on the positive side by thinking it through and acting quickly. But that rethinking of what humanity is capable of and means, I think, has not been integrated yet. And to me, that's one of the emergencies.
Scientists sometimes implicitly think about that. Sometimes they explicitly do. So there are some climate scientists or people who do earth system science who actually talk about very long term. they sometimes do give us perspectives on the role of humans, but I'm also thinking that people who are thinking of geoengineering projects, for instance, are also thinking of human options. And, there are obviously very different kinds of geoengineering projects. So, but what's missing, I think, Emilienne, I agree with you, is the current crisis actually raises a philosophical question. Like, what are human beings today? Are they the same, as Shobha was saying, as the Neolithic human being? Or has technology added to our dimensions so that even if we were small once, we have now become much bigger and become planetary? And to that degree, relatively, the planet has shrunk.
If I may add to that, just very quick, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm very, just a little point. Many people will think to consider this from a philosophical point of view is a waste of time. What we need now is the quick fix. But in fact, no. That's maybe the core message that we could push forward. It is necessary, because action will not be efficient, or I think take on, if that philosophical question is not addressed.
So let me now.
May I just say
Sure.
one sentence?
Yeah, sure.
I'm absolutely 100% in agreement with what Emilienne just said.
Right. Now, I'm just going to create an imaginary split now to facilitate the comments between, let's say, scientists, Shobha and Minal on one side, and Emilienne, you and I on the other side. And one problem with climate change messaging seems to be that when the IPCC talks about a climate emergency, or Minal talks about a gap between where we should be emissions-wise on the temperature calendar, on the temperature axis, and where we are heading to, right? They are talking about this planet as one planet. And the IPCC produces a calendar of action on the assumption that this is one planet. As opposed to that, I often think that humans live in many worlds. I mean, we live on this one planet, but we create many worlds. And even within a nation, we create many worlds with different priorities. And it seems to me that it's so hard to align all the human priorities that come out of these different worlds, our aspirations, our priorities, our problems. You see this with vaccination. To align all that with the calendar of a planet, a planetary calendar, seems very difficult. And I just wonder whether a lot of the messaging problems stem from that very fundamental mismatch between what's happening with the planet and the differences. The humanity remains fragmented. The planet is one. We increasingly realize the planet is one, and wonder whether a popularization of complexity theories, enhancing everybody's capacity to distinguish a linear process from a non-linear process, Shobha was suggesting, would actually give us a way forward. I mean, even when I think that way, I'm actually thinking of the question of how do we as academics in our practices, in our writing, in our teaching, bring the sciences and the humanities together as far as possible. Because I think the split is hurting us, even in messaging, because if you make the message purely into how do we manage the transition from renewable to from non-renewable to renewable, it becomes a technical and economic problem, business problem. I mean, historians have very little to add to it, philosophers even less, right? Whereas if you make it so that's why if you make it a very technically urgent problem, then the messaging becomes narrow, right? And one problem with climate change is really how do you maintain messages of different bandwidth together, it seems to me. How do you maintain the practical options in sight, the low-hanging fruits that we should be picking, along with things that are really still humongous, like if the seas become acidic, what do you do? Right? If the Atlantic in the conveyor belt current that pushes warm water up, I mean, if those things are disturbed, what what do we do? I mean, those are huge, big questions, and geoengineering doesn't fix everything. But so I personally find myself often arguing for a view of the problem where kind of the long-term problems are addressed or at least understood alongside the short-term problems, and their relationships understood, which goes back to, I think, what Shobha was saying about uh, people, our students, and us acquiring the skills to understand the complexity question, in different ways.
I'll just make one small remark. I should have made it earlier. Is that this reading Dipesh's book in order to try to write a review made me aware of a lot of stuff that even at this age I just simply did not know and did not make those connections. For example, a student in a high school is taught about the scientific revolution, our great hero Newton and others, and the Industrial Revolution as one of the greatest achievements of mankind. But invariably, it also brings into focus the societal, the economic regime under which this is happening. So capitalism comes into the picture. But no high school student of science, at least during my time, was ever given that C word while teaching Carnot cycle engines, And this is a huge flaw, even if you think scientifically, that it's even scientifically wrong to not tell people the circumstances in which, you are taking a very, very narrow definition of science in there. So in some sense, it's extremely urgent, yet the point Emilienne is making is that, hurrying into a quick fix, maybe we have to work on parallel channels. Maybe quick fixes we feel will bring some relief to locally or whatever. But at the same time, a big engine should be also working on these big problems. And since we are all academics, academia, I think, has to kind of own up its own deficiencies over a very long period of time and keeping ourselves in silos. And
So Shobha, I was going to suggest that we, will close our part of the discussion and open it up for any audience questions if there are any. But before we do that, I was thinking that since we're all academics, it might be interesting for each of us to mention any instance or steps steps you've taken in your own institution or things you've seen happen in your own institution, which are about messaging climate change, getting students to be aware of it. In Ahmedabad, in Ashoka or Quest, Shobho, in Paris, Emilienne, and I could say a word or two about Chicago. Minal?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to actually quickly go back to your question before I answer this one, and it was about the one planet. And I actually wanted to agree with Professor Sabyasachi very much that it's not going to be one conversation or one message. It's just going to be a lot of parallel tracks with the messages at the planetary level, but also a lot of stories, as Amitav Ghosh or your book talks about. And I think we are missing the stories, a lot of them, and I mean the divide exists, but you recognize it. I think social scientists recognize it a lot better than
Scientists
I
too.
would say climate scientists. I was almost making the mistake of saying real scientists, and I just have to check myself. That was not a nice thing to say. But I'm in the IPCC circuit, right? And I work a lot with climate scientists who work on temperature models and ocean models and circulation models, and the social sciences is just a minority, and because there isn't enough quantitative science there, sometimes it's disregarded.
Yeah.
So somebody was asking actually in the comments, Chandok, I think, that
Yeah.
is sustainable development important, and you can't measure well-being. You can't assign a value to the value, and therefore it becomes it gets dismissed sometimes in the narrative. But just coming back, I could say a lot, but let me come back to your question. And we have this foundation program where we get undergraduate students to work on themes, and climate change is one of the 4 themes that we're running. So everybody across the university has to study climate change.
I see.
And we try to make this a hands-on thing. So once I got them to make models of past civilizations and focus on the climate part, and that really got even the management students to think about this at a different level. So I think, but Professor Sabyasachi, you're right that we are teaching in silos, and we really need to work on how to make teaching interdisciplinary. Because in my MBA class, they'll just think, "Oh, right, it's a great course, but what is it going to be useful in my life?" And this is the question I face every year with the MBA students. And they're bright people. They understand, they read, but yet they don't think this applies to them. But I'll stop here.
Okay, yeah. Emilienne?
So we have entered a big discussion on how we can harmonize climate change education all over the university. And for the moment, we started, this is the first year, with a series of lectures and discussions at the beginning of the academic year so that all students can be free to attend. So they're very, as you know, logistical, ridiculous. When you think of the dimension of the problem, it seems ridiculous, but it's very concrete problems of how do you get everybody, let's say 20,000 students or 15,000 to access the same kind of information at the level at which they think they need it. Do you do it online, just put a few courses, or do you make it compulsory and so on? So we have this discussion going on, and we are part of a network, the U7 Plus network, where I am part of a working group on trying to find the best practices for rapid access to education. Concerning the SDGs, I've got to say that one of the discussions is it useful to frame this within the SDGs, where climate action is only one of the questions addressed. And I can talk about the pros and cons afterwards if we go back to this question.
Sure. And Shobhu, from your experience in India?
It's the strategy I have found useful is the same as what Minal is saying, is that tell stories. So I'll give you, 1 or 2 examples of what stories get through. So there's this big temple in India called Kedarnath. And Kedarnath is a holy place, and a large number of pilgrims go there every year at a given time. And there was a major landslide near Kedarnath temple. And I had asked my class to look at the videos that's available everywhere and, write a note on why did they think that this has happened. So what it is that this temple was built on a huge piece of granite, a huge rock. And there is regular soil around. So people who obviously knew where to build the temple to make it last long. And the immense amount of deforestation has happened. The forests were removed, shops had come up, and little hotels, all of this to supply the pilgrim industry. And when rains came, and the rains do come every year, perhaps it was a little more, but not significantly more, increasingly you are reaching the edge point where there is nothing to hold the topsoil because the tree roots aren't there. And the tree roots hold a huge amount of topsoil, and they are not there, and therefore everything just came crashing down. You can draw, in a country like ours, you can draw two different conclusions. One is the holiness of the temple, that in this disaster, the temple survived, and the sinners around perished. The other is that you just cut down too many trees. And the second one is more appealing because it makes so much sense. You can even demonstrate in a class by taking a little plant in a pot, remove the plant, and see how much topsoil comes out with the roots.
So Minal's suggestion is what I found most effective in giving them some close to home examples of the big picture. So this is not to say that this is climate change, but it is one of the examples of indiscriminate, massacring of your environment. What real effect it does, and even not even the most hardened scientist will say that this is not important.
So
Getting rid of
actually, Shobho, I mean, yeah, no, I think that point is completely taken storytelling. And Minal was also saying that in Ahmedabad, every student is exposed to climate change, that structurally. And I was going to say in Chicago, what I noticed, which is very encouraging, is both kind of grassroots development as well as top down. And grassroots, I find, at least in social science humanities, that our colleagues have begun to teach courses and create tracks. So that now in social science, there's an energy history track, where you basically study societies in terms of the modes of energy consumption and production that they engaged in. Colleagues in English and sociology have actually also started producing video games as pedagogical tools and producing narratives for climate change for video games. And our new president has just set up this university-wide committee, and Chicago is not exceptional. In fact, most American universities are setting up institutions or something to address climate change. But the difference in my observation with Chicago is that the Chicago initiative is university-wide, and it includes humanists, and it includes social scientists, anthropologists. So my hope is that we will be able to create at least a forum where people from different disciplines come together, present their disciplined work, so that we listen to each other's disciplinary vocabulary and get some sense of what they're getting at, because it's such a complex problem. So we are coming to the end of our time. If somebody wanted to pick up Chandok's question, is Chandok's question whether sustainable is, Chandok is asking, when we talk about climate change, the big corporations tend to point towards unsustainable development or a green economy. But given the urgency of the situation, how relevant are these solutions? So anybody interested in answering that question? Green economy and sustainable development, are they whitewash or greenwashing capitalism, or is there more substance to it?
I think, Minal, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to say from my experience as a diplomat first, where we saw the SDGs come forward, being pushed really by the United Nations and the different countries that adhere to them. They are useful in terms of serializing problems and encouraging people to focus. But there is a sense of, okay, choose one, choose two, and then you can focus on those. I think they are all subsumed by climate change action, but they are useful today, at least, because they enable people to continue to a certain degree on the track where they, are chugging along, or the cause, quote unquote, they are interested in, and at the same time work towards a common goal. And so perhaps enter a frame of mind where more will be possible.
Any other stabs at this?
I'll make one statement, maybe two. One is, sustainable development. Does it imply sustainable for the entire planet? I think that would be a tall order. What one may want to do is an old physics trick, which is find a subsystem, a rather small subsystem, which is most weakly connected to its immediate surroundings, and try and see if you can solve. And this may be one of those low-hanging fruits that create sustainable subsystems, knowing full well that as soon as these subsystems begin to interact, the problems will no longer be subsystem. But try to have strategies. That is, because we cannot be perfect, we shouldn't do anything. It just answers that question.
No, I totally agree with you. That's the very first point that Amartya Sen actually makes in his book on justice. That just because I can't solve the whole problem doesn't mean that I don't try to solve a part of it that I can.
So
But
there is that I think is one simple way to.
But I also agree with him. What I think Emilienne was saying something same, that something similar. That we live with big corporations. We live with technologies, and they have to be part of the solution in whatever we think. I mean, in fact, Michael Mann, the physicist who also works on climate change, in his recent book, he quotes somebody else saying that if you think that ending capitalism is more important than doing anything else, then you don't take the climate problem seriously enough. That was the urgency is such that we all have to come to the party, not all working on the same scale or on the same problem. And I kind of think, some scientists have argued that global warming has fended off the next ice age. Now, if we have, there's not much we can do about that. It could be a scientific fact. Or my colleague David Archer says that we have already changed the climate of the planet for the next 100,000 years. If we have, we have. So not all facts are actionable, even if they're scientific facts.
Yeah, I just actually wanted to jump in. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. Minal,
Yeah.
please.
No, I just wanted to add that yes, technology will be a part of the solution, but not the only solution. And the problem, the narrative we are going towards, as also Emilienne was saying, is that technology will solve everything. And so now, because behavioral change may not be able to address the big gap, so we'll have large scale tree plantations and CDR and solar radiation and everything, and then we are fine. And so a lot of funding is going towards that, and not. So I think the messaging scale is important in the coming.
Absolutely,
years.
and I think we have to criticize that part of the statement that says you will be fine, because these things will produce their own problems. I don't think we will be fine.
I just have one rather minor point to make, and that is anecdotally, is that what I find that younger people appear to be much more engaged with the climate problem than older ones. Perhaps one reason is that they will face it more. And number two, that their head isn't yet full of all the other things that we have learned, and they're willing to look at things as they are rather than having preconceived notions.
Sure, yeah.
So that is very hopeful. That by and large, statistically, young people appear to be much more receptive to this information.
It's more their problem than ours, yeah. Look, we have come to the end of our time. And first of all, I want to thank my colleagues at the Delhi Center and Obhik and Anitesh and their colleagues at proho.com for making this conversation possible. And I really thank all three of you, absolutely from the bottom of my heart, for joining us on this program. It's been very, very pleasurable and instructive to be in conversation with you. So have a good rest of the day wherever you are, and hopefully I'll be seeing you soon. Bye then.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us. Bye bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.